Welcome. Welcome to all of you to our first annual Cesar y Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series. Prior to beginning our program here, let me start off by sharing with you that at a time when our nation wrestled with acute symptoms of inequality for all Americans, Cesar Chavez emerged as a leader whose hard work and dedication helped us understand a history of disparity as a way to create an optimistic future of social integration. Through decades of dialogue and implementing learning strategies, he and many others convinced workers and eventually our nation that access of opportunity could indeed be achieved for all. Good afternoon. My name is Reyes Ortega, and as chair of the Sierra College New Legacy Committee, I especially want to welcome you to the Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series. This year, the theme of our event focuses on one very fundamental and significant question. Does an African American president mean an end to racism? In a recent extensive interview with the New Yorker magazine, President Barack Obama took a moment to reflect upon this question by recognizing that his election indeed signified change and progress. Quote, "I think it signifies progress, that progress is an ongoing process, and that it requires that each of us try to expand our sense of understanding." End quote. This afternoon, our moderator, Dr. Leo Chavez, will guide us through a very special opportunity to expand our own sense of understanding about the historical, socio-political, and cultural transformations of diversity within our classrooms, our campus, our region, and America. Once again, on behalf of the New Legacy Committee, welcome to all, to our distinguished panelists, and to Dr. Leo Chavez.
Thank you, and let me add to Reyes's welcome. It's good to see all of you here. Good to see so many active minds, engaged minds. California in particular, but also I think the United States in general, is a real important crossroads. An awful lot of key policy decisions are being addressed right now. And for those of you who are going to have to make some decisions in terms of the electoral box and other places, it's good to see you making the effort to be as informed as you can. My job is very simple. It's simply to introduce the panelists and try to keep things moving. I want to point out that at the end of today's presentation, we're going to take some questions. And so throughout each of the panelists' discussions today, you'll see staff members walking up and down the aisle. They'll have 3x5 index cards. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand. They'll come by with the index card, collect it at the end. And then our hope is that we'll have a little bit of time to see if among all those questions, one or more themes emerge, and we'll try to select a question that represents some of those themes and then ask the panelists to address or to answer that question. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd just like to give you one little concept or thought to ponder. Having been a history teacher for many years, I always used to like to focus on what I call the three major ideas in American society, those three major ideas being the idea of democracy, the idea of capitalism, and the idea of race. And if you look at our history over the course of the last several hundred years, I would argue and ask you to think about the fact that of all those ideologies, the one that has undergone the least amount of change is the ideology of race. Factor that into the presentation. Let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate right, our Community College Chancellor, Dr. Jack C. Scott. Dr. Scott is responsible for all community colleges in California, head of the Board of Governors that governs community colleges to the extent that we're governed. And basically his job is to represent you before the legislature. He is the man who goes to the governor, who goes to the legislature arguing on our behalf that we be treated fairly and properly in budget deliberations. Dr. Scott has a long and distinguished history as a teacher, as a college president, as a member of the State Assembly and Senate, as a man who was in charge of putting together our budget and advocating those. and to this day remains our biggest friend, our staunchest ally, our biggest supporter, and quite possibly the most important figure in Sacramento representing your interest as well as those of the staff. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Clarence Walker. He's a history professor at the University of California at Davis. His research interests include Black American history, 1450 to the present, 19th century social and political history of the United States, and a history of sexuality, film, and popular culture. And I'd like to thank you very much for making the drive, is it up or down, from Davis to visit us. It's far, he says. To his right is Dr. Bruce Haynes, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Davis. He specializes in the study of race and ethnic group relations within the context of urban and suburban community development. Dr. Haynes, welcome. Thank you for coming. And to his right, Dr. Tom Nussbaum. I think Tom is someone that Dr. Scott likes to look at because it proves that there can be life after being chancellor. Tom Nussbaum, before he began his current occupation as adjunct professor of law, was the chancellor for the California Community Colleges and served in that capacity for quite some time. Before then, he was a vice chancellor and chief legal counsel for the California Community Colleges. So we have on our panel two people who know community colleges better than just about anyone I can imagine, and also have their own subject expertise, as well as two professors who deal with this topic on a daily basis. So with that introduction, I'd like to ask Dr. Scott to either remain seated or come forward to the podium. Each of the panelists has been given a topic to address with us. Dr. Scott has been asked to address his personal reflection on societal changes brought about by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, recommending to each of you how you might become more involved in political and social reform. Sir? Feel more comfortable?
Well, certainly it's exciting to me to be here at Sierra College. I was privileged to be here a few months ago at the opening of your school year and speak to the faculty and staff at that time. You have an impressive campus here, and it's always a joy to speak to a group of students. I was privileged to attend the inauguration of Barack Obama as President of the United States. It was a historic occasion. I can't fully describe the excitement that was in the crowd at that time and how everyone felt that this was a momentous occasion, a real historical landmark. However, to the question, has racism ended as a result of the election of a president who is African American? I guess I would have to answer it with a resounding no. I don't think that the election of Barack Obama is going to lead to the dissolution of the Aryan Nation or the Ku Klux Klan. I don't think it's going to stop all of those whispered words and jokes that are often made as people talk about the subject of race. I don't think that it will stop the denial of promotions that occur to those of color, or the fact that jobs and housing are in some instances denied as a basis of one's racial or ethnic origin. These things are too deeply ingrained in American society. And so violence, unfortunately, will continue to occur against gays and against the people of color simply based upon either their sexual orientation or their ethnicity. You see, I think racism is endemic, unfortunately, in American culture. We tend to be taught very early, and we distinguish people. We look at people and immediately are able to see whether that person is African American or Asian American or Latino. We don't make those kind of distinctions in terms of left-handedness and right-handedness, or the color of one's eyes, or the height of an individual. But we are taught very early about differences in race and ethnicity. And you might ask, why in the world do we have racism? Whatever caused this to occur? And I've given some thought to that. I'm not sure I can give you the exact answer to it. But I think one of the keys is the desire of human beings to be superior to somebody else. And when we don't measure that in terms of merit, we do it in terms of some casual differences that exist. And so race becomes one of those means. And also, color is also a means of justifying unjustifiable behavior. One of the reasons in American history that a distinguishing characteristic of race was so important was the issue of slavery. If you enslave somebody, you have to think of a reason for doing it. And one of the reasons that was thought of was the fact that those of African origin were inferior. And so, after all, they deserved to be enslaved, or at least slavery was justified. And I think all of us ought to start off with the idea that merely by being born an American citizen, or maybe I could say a citizen of the world, because I'll guarantee you that racism is not restricted to the United States of America. We find it in all places, the distinctions that are made. I want to make a personal comment here about racism. As you can see by my gray hair, I was born some time ago. And I was born on the right side of the tracks. What do I mean by that? I was born white, I was born male, and I was born straight. Now, those gave me some advantages, and some very distinct advantages. In fact, I was born in a West Texas town in which segregation existed openly. And as a youth, I didn't think much about it. It took me a while to look around and suddenly think to myself, something's wrong here. After all, I'd grown up in a Christian church, a church which, by the way, would have barred someone that was African American from attending that church. He would have been stopped or she would have been stopped at the back door and told politely to go attend a church that was a church for African Americans. But I began to look around, and my Christian heritage taught me something that said, whatsoever you would that men do unto you, do you also unto them. And I couldn't square that golden rule with the behavior in my hometown, or the behavior that I'd been taught was normal. And so I became suddenly informed on the issues, suddenly recognizing that to deny people jobs, to restrict them to menial jobs, to restrict women as far as that was concerned, to not menial jobs, but not to jobs of authority. No principal in a school, for instance, was a woman. No lawyer, no doctor. And obviously, if I had displayed characteristics of being a gay person, I would have experienced some clear discrimination and perhaps even violence. And so slowly I became aware that this is wrong. Why do I consider racism morally wrong? Well, I've given you one reason. All religious traditions that are taught well come to the conclusion that all people are loved by God and are of equal nature. In the New Testament, it says that in Jesus Christ there's neither male nor female, slave nor free. None of these distinctions should be made. But I also realized that it was a violation of our highest American ideals. Like Dr. Chavez, my background is history. I have a PhD in that subject. And the Declaration of Independence says very clearly that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, admittedly, we would change that to all men and women are created equal, but we are, at least that was the ideal of America. And it took America a long, long time to even move to abolish those kinds of distinctions. Do you know at the time that America was founded in 1776, 20% of the population were enslaved African Americans. And finally in 1865, at the conclusion of the Civil War, slavery was declared to be illegal. But that didn't stop racism. In fact, you recall the civil rights movement that began in the 1950s, and perhaps the most famous proponent of that civil rights movement was Martin Luther King with his stirring declaration. But finally in 1954, it was declared that no longer could there be separate and so-called equal schooling in America, that distinction had to be broken down. And so we began to make progress. And I wouldn't deny at all that there hasn't been progress. It's clearly some progress. But still, when you stop and consider the fact that there's a disproportionate number of individuals that are imprisoned who are people of color, that there's a disproportionate of the fact that unemployment, I read recently that unemployment is something like 15 to 16% in our black population, whereas it's less than 10% in the population as a whole. Black males are far more likely to be arrested, far more likely to be executed. All of these facts are screaming statistics that tell us that we still have some ways to go. But it's not only morally wrong, it is economically foolish. When we deny the use of all of our human resources based upon such insignificant factors as gender or race, then we're cheating ourselves of some great, great talent. Back in history in 1492, Spain decided that they no longer would abide Jews and Muslims living in their country, so they expelled them. What happened? Suddenly the Spanish Empire began to shrink in its power, and places like the Netherlands, who opened its arms to individuals such as Jews and Muslims, began to prosper. Why? Because all of that talent and ability was present. Can you imagine how much better we would have been, say, in the 19th century in America if we had given women and people of color equal chance? How many geniuses existed? How many people of political ability would have been found in those ranks? But those were denied. In fact, every president of the United States has been a white male, with the exception of the recent election. I don't think that's because those of us who are white males deserve that kind of distinction, but it was because that we had unnatural distinctions that were raised. And so, at a time when we're celebrating Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King, and others, we need to recommit ourselves to the recognition that we still have a long way to go. And let me suggest to you that are young in this audience, decide now to side with the disenfranchised, with the weak, with the powerless, because frequently that's what the problem has been. Those who are lacking in power, such as those of people of color, and in many instances women and others, they needed someone to side with them, to speak up for them, to say this is wrong, as the Hebrew prophets of old used to rail out against the rich when they were abusing and oppressing the poor. So we have, after all, a great dream of equality in America, something which I buy into and I believe in, and incidentally, one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about the community college. It's because the community college is a place of equality. We take all people, as I sometimes say, the upper 100%. If you graduated from high school, you come here. If you're an individual of poverty, you can come here. If you're a person of color, we welcome you with open arms. And that's why that our population mirrors the ethnic population of California, because we're a place of equality. But equality still has a long way to go. The inner city schools that exist in our nation are not equal to the affluent suburban schools. The teachers, for instance, that are employed in the inner city schools often end up to be the least experienced teachers. And so when those pink slips come out in March, they're the place where are the hardest hit as far as teachers are concerned and so forth. Just imagine, if you will, two individuals in our society. One is a white youngster in our suburban school. The other is an African-American young boy in the inner city. In the first place, they start off in homes, one home which has an abundance of books and some cultural advantages, and maybe in the other home there's a single mother struggling as hard as she can, but maybe having two jobs to hold down, and so there's some cultural disadvantages. And so when they enter school at the very first grade, or kindergarten, there's a disadvantage already there. But then you couple that with the fact that in many of our inner city schools, the facilities are poor, the teachers are less experienced, the books are less plentiful, the streets have some problems. And so then suddenly these two individuals come up to their senior year and they seek entrance into a institution of higher education. And then somebody says, well, you know, their SAT scores are different. So we're going to let this young man from the white suburbs go into school, but we're going to deny entrance to this young black youth. Well, you see the inequity that's involved, an inequity that's built into our society. So all I can say is, no, we haven't reached utopia yet. And as long as we're human beings infallible, we won't reach utopia, but that doesn't keep us from trying. That doesn't keep us from being on the side of what we believe is right economically, is right morally, is right in every extent. Our ideal in America is that we're all come together, many of us from all nations throughout the world, and we have immigrated and we've come to these shores. And we came to these shores because we wanted equal opportunity. But equal opportunity can only exist when the barriers of discrimination are removed, and when people of all colors and all backgrounds are given the opportunity that they so richly deserve. So I'm glad to be here on Cesar Chavez Day. It's not actually the day, but it's right after the day that we celebrate his birthday. I am here certainly as someone who profited from Martin Luther King, because King pointed out that he was not only going to grant freedom to those of color, but he was going to grant freedom to those of us who are white, because as long as other people are in bondage and treated unfairly, then in that respect we all suffer. So I'm looking forward to the comments of this distinguished panel. I look forward to answering your questions.
Okay. Next, I'll ask Dr. Clarence Walker to address us. He will address us on the topic of segregation and integration, where is America in the debate of race and politics? And Clarence will stay at the table.
Dr. Scott and I share something in common. We're both Texans, and I'm probably quite as old as he, even though I've shaved my head. But I never thought, as a historian, that the election of Barack Obama represented the end of racism in the United States. I thought that it was a great step forward, and I also thought that it was an important moment in the history of this nation. But I understand that America has never had one invariant system of racism, but a multiplicity of racisms. You have the genocide and dispossession of the Native Americans, the enslavement and Jim Crowing of blacks, the colonization of Mexicans, and the exclusion of Asians, and on top of that, the whole racialization of Eastern and Southern European Americans at the end of the 19th century and in the first part of the 20th century. So when we talk about racism in America, we have to talk about a multiplicity of racisms, not just one. And what was most interesting about this recent presidential campaign, I think, was the fact that Obama really tried to avoid the issue of race. He never ran really as a black man, and it only became apparent, it seems to me, to large sectors of both the black and the white populations of the United States that he was a black man when his minister said those rather unfortunate words about God-damning America, which were interpreted out of context and not embedded, it seems to me, in the context of the tradition called the Jeremiad, which is a form of preaching coming from the Puritans an end to broad and mainstream Protestantism in the 19th and the 20th century. Obama's election, I think, reflects in many ways that the country is a far more integrated country than I was a child or when Professor Scott was a child, and certainly far more so than the state of California was in the 1940s when my family arrived here. But I also think that you have continuing segregation, if not by race, certainly by class in this country. You have large sectors of the populace not and able to pursue decent educations, who live in segregated communities, and who are in many ways disenfranchised because of their socioeconomic level of accomplishment. And in the case of Obama, he really is sort of an American success story, it seems to me, in that he came from rather poor and humble roots. He went to a very good private college, Occidental College, and then he transferred to Columbia University, and then he went on from there to be Harvard JD, and then a law professor, and now President of the United States. So in some ways embodies then this American notion of success. But at the same time, I think, as Professor Scott pointed out, there is a great deal of unease in the country about him, racially and also socially, that goes far beyond, I think, these whole questions of the recent debates about the health care plan, but also to a general sort of stereotyping of black politicians in this country historically, which Obama in many ways sorts of confounds. He's sort of the American apple pie boy dream of the world. He has a beautiful wife and two beautiful children. He has not been accused of stealing or of having affairs with other women, or for that matter, engaged in various and other nefarious activities, which our political history of late has been marked by. So this guy is really a goody two-shoes, and maybe more so than some people would like to think that a black man was capable of being. But the fact of the matter remains that this is not the presidency of Bill Clinton. There is no Monica Lewinsky stalking in the corridors. There is also no case of William Jefferson, the congressman from Louisiana, who was found to mysteriously have $100,000 secreted in his freezer under the chitlins, the gumbo, or whatever. There is also no Jesse Jackson here and no Al Sharpton. What you really have, and I think that's most interesting about this presidency, is that if this was another country other than America, this presidency would be seen, as it really is, as a right-of-center presidency. I mean, the whole notion that this constitutes a liberalism, one that we could say descended rather logically or dramatically from the work of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I think is a case of wishful thinking. That this man is president of the United States because of a strange confluence of events. First and foremost was an economic downturn. I do not think that if the economy had continued to grow, that Obama would be president. I think that McCain would have been president if he ran a better campaign. I think that the case here is that this was some kind of fluke or fortuitous situation in which Obama was able to take advantage of that. And I think in many ways he and his whole presentation of self represents the best of an integrated America. He is both conversant with the culture, the broader culture, and with his own minority culture. He seems to be able to move between both worlds without any sort of problem. This, for many black Americans of my age, was a problem, and they were deeply suspicious of him, and I think this is not to be forgotten, that this was a man who was marked by neither the history of segregation or the civil rights movement, that he was a new being, a new politician, and for that reason, they didn't know how to receive him. But it seems to me that the guy has really demonstrated quite clearly that he is a master of the political, and that he has, in the last couple of weeks, rebounded or redounded from what looked to be a complete and utter disaster, that his presidency would have been in the toilet if he had not been able to pull off this health care deal. Now, whatever happens to this, we don't know, but we'll see that this, it seems to me, was a major triumph. And in terms of the history of legislation in the United States, it brings us further into the age of modernity. Keep in mind that the Germans had Social Security in the 19th century. And so that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed this during the New Deal, it wasn't a new or alien idea. It was an idea that had been around for a long time, in the same way that most of the Western democracies have some kind of social health system for their people. It is not socialism, which Americans don't seem to be able to distinguish, at least some of them, between fascism and socialism. A great and sad commentary, I hate to say it, Chancellor, on our education system, but that's a different story. The fact of the matter remains is that this has been a remarkable step forward from the days of Martin Luther King and the struggles of the civil rights movement. And I'm happy to have lived long enough to have seen this, and thank you.
Next to address us is Dr. Bruce Haynes, Associate Professor of Sociology, University of California, Davis, who will talk to us on why should we consider the contributions of different ethnic groups and their experiences in our policies.
Well, I'm sure you can see why Professor Walker is a very popular lecturer at Davis's campus. Thank you for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished members. Before Barack Obama was elected to the presidency, I never dreamed that America would elect a black president in my lifetime. I was born in 1960, and I remember watermelons being thrown at buses being integrated in Boston in the 1970s when I was in junior high school. So the election of Barack Obama certainly signifies change. In fact, we might argue that the old mantra of American exceptionalism triumphs again, but this time with a more sunburnt, multicolored face. America is indeed a multi-ethnic and multiracial society. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and even non-believers. But America's plural nation came about from ignominious origins, not simply from voluntary immigration. As has been echoed by both Professor Scott and Professor Walker, the exploitation of land, labor, and relegation and marginalization of millions of Africans, Mexicans, Native peoples, and Asians to the non-industrial labor force is part of that ignominious origin. So today this panel has been asked to contemplate, does an African-American president mean an end to racism? Does the election of this biracial son of an immigrant African mean that America has entered a post-racial moment? Many proclaimed that this election is more than symbolic, that it's actually representative of equality achieved, that blacks have made it past racism. In fact, some would say that the fact that I'm standing here speaking to you would be evidence of that fact. From Bill Bennett to Campbell Brown, the notion that we entered a post-racial era was widespread in the news and on the web following Barack's election. Somehow, Obama himself was presented as the post-racial candidate, even though race has always remained a pivotal issue throughout the campaign and since his election to office. On November 4th, 2008, New York Times writer Adam Nagorny captured this general sentiment best when he said, quote, "Barack Hussein Obama was elected 44th President of the United States on Tuesday, sweeping away the last racial barrier in American politics with ease as the country chose him as its first black chief executive." So the question is, was racism really wiped away on November 4th? And is that a reasonable conclusion? Barack Hussein Obama's election to the presidency of the U.S., of course, is merely just a first, like many firsts in American history. Barack merely is the first to cross a particular racial boundary in American society. However important and symbolic that boundary may be, does an African-American president mean an end to racism? Does it represent systemic change? Or does it really represent a certain kind of progress for American racial minorities? In fact, if all racism in America ended at this moment, right now, would the majority of black and brown people in America feel a difference in their lives? How significant would that difference really be? I suggest that most of their problems would remain in place. Racial inequality has a kind of historical memory in this country. It's embedded in housing inequality, in redlining, in FHA policy, and in predatory lending that we see today by payday lenders and, in fact, by mortgage institutions. And it's in the persistent racial gap in wealth that gets accumulated across generations. And what about the strong racial backlash that we're witnessing today that seems to have gripped segments of the American electorate? Whether we talk about the Palin rallies back in 2008, where I saw Obama pancakes being sold because he was waffling, as it was. Or I'm sorry, it was Obama waffles, not pancakes. People carried monkeys in effigy. Some called him a terrorist, a Muslim, a socialist, black, a communist. All after his election, in fact, when the Holocaust Museum security guard was gunned down by the aging white supremacist. Or the recent attacks on Capitol Hill of our elected officials by some Tea Party supporters. Spitting? Is that the real America? Or the general anti-government sentiment and racial fever that seems to have recently turned to challenging the very legitimacy of the president and his policies, no matter how moderate or mainstream they may actually be. And it's been said in public forums by elected officials and others about President Obama that this so-called elitist president wants to control what we have, that he wants to control guns, control freedom of speech, that he's a pirate in D.C. There have been so-called backroom deals over the health care bill, and some have suggested that they are suspicious of bribes and payoffs. It's said that the president is fundamentally un-American, and that something is not quite right in Washington and in government. Obama is maybe a big mistake, that his policies are against the Constitution, that he represents a mysterious end to freedom. The racial innuendos seem unending in our political discourse these days. The discussion by too many news outlets has been caustic and disingenuous. Polemics and sensationalism have replaced civil discourse and critical inquiry from the right as well as from the left. But the political realities suggest that we have neither ended racism nor have we entered a period of radical left politics in American government. We are in a post-industrial America that continues to be polarized by race-based inequalities. Globalization has restructured local economies, and the trend recently has been towards economic bifurcation. Some make $9 an hour, while others earn $10 million in bonuses for gambling the company away. I agree with Cornel West in the challenge that he articulated to the president in his January 4th, 2010 video address. Professor West asked, the question is not, have we moved beyond race in America? The question, my dear brother President Barack Obama, how deep is your love for the poor and working people? As Professor Scott articulated, Obama faces a great challenge in this era of industrial decline, globalization, and post-60s promise of racial equality for all Americans, including the black and brown among us. Equality requires access to education and access to jobs. Obama faces a similar challenge that the California University education system faces today. How do we create equality and opportunity for historically underrepresented racial minorities in the face of economic change and, in many cases, dwindling resources? Appointing a minority president, while a great beginning, is only just that, a beginning. How do we bring more minority students and faculty into the university and to the community college system when their secondary schools and communities are underserved and under-resourced? While the election of Obama is a symbolic event that brought tears to my eyes back on that historic day in November, let us keep our eyes on the prize. While healthcare reform is beginning, I'm as yet disappointed with the conditions facing most black and brown communities in America today. Most were in fact in recession before we entered the Great Recession of 2008. Today, many communities exist in Depression-era-like conditions. But ever since 9/11, their concerns have pretty much been invisible in our public discourse. There's a war abroad, but the challenge against poverty and social exclusion at home remains. As Barbara Ehrenreich so articulately put it, the recession of the 1980s transformed the working class into the working poor. But the current recession is knocking the working poor down another notch, from inadequate into no housing, from low-wage employment towards erratic employment. In the last 3 decades, we indeed locked up over 1 million people. Many were first-time drug offenders. We placed them in prison with hardcore violent prisoners, 6, 8, maybe 10 years, and we'll soon be releasing many of them to communities near you, because the $30,000 to $50,000 a year to keep them incarcerated is becoming prohibitive. So a looming crisis is facing many black and brown communities across California and America. And then there are, of course, the rural landlocked areas, places like West Virginia coal country, places where private jails provide employment. Our responsibility is clear. Like Chavez and King, we must hold our brother president accountable and at the same time not let the voices of reaction and fear drown out our collective voices for racial and economic progress. Not progress just on the surface in terms of attitudes, but progress towards transforming the very structures that shape unequal outcomes in America. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, and I look forward to your comments.
And before we bring our next speaker up, I want to remind everyone again of the opportunity to ask questions. So ask for the 3x5 index card, fill them out with your question, and we'll pick them up in just a few minutes so we can address those issues. So next, you're going to stay there, Tom? Okay. Next, Dr. Tom Nussbaum. Dr. Nussbaum, who, as you've heard earlier, not only led our community college system, but is currently a professor at McGeorge School of Law, will address us on what students, faculty, and staff can do to ensure increased political involvement toward the goal of a fully representative and involved government and politics. What is going on in politics today is that politics as usual. Tom?
Thank you, Leo. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I too look forward to the discussion and questions afterwards. To the students in the audience, I need to let you know you have a great college here. Sierra is a very good college with a great faculty and staff. We have a president that I admire and hold in high regard. And I just want to say to you, bravo for improving your life and meeting your educational goals. It's going to make a difference in your life, but the very topic that we're talking about today, the future of our country and the state of California, it's going to make a difference there too. So bravo to you. And to the faculty and staff in this room, some and many of whom I may know from the past, it's been a tough couple of years, and unfortunately there's no end in sight. But I got to say to you, all during the time I was chancellor, I saw the faculty and staff of our colleges rise up and keep working with the students, working the miracles, doing what we do best in the community colleges. So I need to say to you, hang in there. It's going to get better, and you too have an important role that you know that you're playing in the lives of our students in the state of California. The cuts that we're suffering now are not in the interests of students, not in the interests of the state. It's bad public policy, but we're going to have to weather this together. And I thought about the state of conditions in California and America in preparation for this talk today. I kind of had these ambivalent feelings, and I was feeling elated but apprehensive, enthusiastic but chastened, hopeful but pessimistic. And when I think about the issue of diversity and racism and progress on tolerance and equal opportunity in America, I'm feeling heartened but somewhat disenchanted. So what's up with these ambivalent feelings? And that's what I'd like to focus on. First, the good news. And like Bruce and the other panelists and anyone over 50 in this room, I never thought I would see the election of a person of color as president during my lifetime, and I regard it as a true milestone. And I too wept on election night and felt a great deal of pride and a sense of progress in this country. It is truly a milestone. There's more good news, and I wanted to talk about the good news first. That's usually the best thing to do. And that is the issue of voter turnout. In the election in November 2008, 131 million people voted. That's 5 million more people that voted from the November 2004 election. And as you know, the political scientists among us would know, in terms of voter turnout, the highest turnout is usually the older white voters. And that the youth voters, unfortunately students, and sometimes African American and Latino, Asian voters tend to vote in lower percentages. Well, in the November 2008 election, 5 million more people voted, and 2 million more blacks voted than the prior election, 2 million more Hispanic voters than the prior election, 600,000 more Asian voters than the prior election, and in terms of the youth vote, it was the only age group that had a significantly increased percentage of turnout. So the youth vote turned out, and as you well know, about 2/3 of the youth vote voted for Barack Obama. So it is a good news that we've elected a person of color, good news that we have voter turnout and more political involvement from groups that haven't been as politically involved. And then when we look at the issue of who's occupying our Congress and our state houses, the legislators, we have a quest in this country to have a diversity that reflects our population of the office holders. And if we look at that goal, and I know growing up 50 years ago in 1960, you looked at the California legislature, you looked at Congress, it was an exclusively white male bastion. So what's happened in the last 50 years? Well, the data from 2010, California legislature, we have 120 legislators, 9 are African American, 26 are Latino, 10 are Asian Pacific Islander, 33 are women. In terms of progress in Congress, we have House of Representatives, and it's less impressive in Congress, but still, considering it was a white male bastion, 435 members of the House of Representatives, 42 African American, 25 Hispanic, 5 are Asian, and 78 are women. And in terms of the 100 members of the Senate, 1 is African American, 2 are Hispanic, 2 are Asian, and 18 are women. So again, progress. Maybe not as much as we need, but progress nonetheless. More good news, healthcare reform. Bruce talked about this. We go back on care reform multiple decades. Many presidents, Republican and Democrat, have been working on this issue 50, 60 years. It is a milestone for this country that we have passed healthcare reform legislation. 32 million more people will be able to get health care that were previously unable. And there are many improvements in the law. Is it everything we wanted it to be, or at least that I wanted it to be? No. There were a lot of compromises along the way, but it is nonetheless a huge milestone. and progress. More good news, and this is for anyone in this room that's been alive for at least 50 years. I think back, and I've been alive for 61, I think there would be widespread agreement that there is less illegal discrimination, less racism, greater social and economic opportunity for more of our people. And like my fellow panelists, no, racism is not a thing of the past. It's not a thing of the past. But we are definitely making progress in achieving new milestones. Now, these are the things that I've talked about are the good news. I told you I've had these ambivalent feelings. Well, now, what are those ambivalent feelings? What's the bad news? Well, as Leo said, I teach public policy development at McGeorge. And one of the things I look at, and we look at, is how our legislatures work. And so if we look at California government and the US Congress, what we are seeing more and more these days is gridlock and dysfunction. And if you examine the debate that goes on in Congress and the California legislature, you will see that it is angry and extremely partisan. And all too often it appears that the members are trying to defeat, one party is trying to defeat the other party rather than to solve problems. And we're not letting the facts or the truth get in the way. Politics is becoming a contest of wills rather than a search for common interests and solving our problems. And this, to me, is very bad news. It's a very bad trend. Just in this week's Newsweek, Ellis Coase, in the November 12th edition, talks about the ugly rhetoric that is perverting our politics. And he notes the increasing racial slurs, homophobic epithets, outright mistruths, irresponsible and highly partisan language, and he says, other poisonous talk that is, quote, absorbed undiluted into the body politic. It's this kind of information that is accepted as truth by a shockingly high percent of our public. And he notes, the more serious danger from this corrosive conduct and the failure to acknowledge it for what it is to our fraying national sense of purpose, a symptom of what happens when the citizens of a country can't talk with one another constructively. This is bad news. We have our state houses that are not only more gridlocked and dysfunctional, but they are dominated by special interests. Let's focus on the Congress. 2009, lobbying expenditures for Congress. You ready? $3.47 billion was spent on lobbying Congress. There were 13,741 lobbyists running around trying to influence policy, led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who spent $144 million, ExxonMobil, $27 million, GE, $27 million, Big Pharmacy, $50 million. The list goes on. In California, the latest data we have is 2005. We spent $228 million lobbying the legislature, led by the California Teachers Association at $9.4 million, AT&T $4 million, Western States Petroleum $3.1 million. Now, folks, this is just the lobbying money. This is the money spent lobbying. This isn't the money for campaigns, where we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars more. And speaking of campaigns, the more bad news, we are not only have dysfunctional state houses that are dominated by special interests, but what's it take to get elected to public office these days? Say any of you want to run for the California legislature, the Assembly, or the Senate, you know you need about a cool $1 million to run for those offices. House of Representatives, another easily $1 million. If you want to run for the U.S. Senate, you better have over $5 million. That's probably absolute minimum. I don't know about any of you, but I don't have that kind of money laying around. And so the people who run for office, you have to be one or two things. You have to be either independently wealthy, and if you look at the roster of who's in Congress and especially who's in the U.S. Senate. You will see wealthy individuals. Or you're going to have to be beholden or dependent at least on those special interests who will help fund your campaigns. Because otherwise, where are you going to come up with that kind of money? So costs of running for office, the increasing costs, are a concern. I don't need to tell you that we're in the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. And we have, as you know, highest unemployment for a long, long time. Huge rates of poverty. Governments, and yet governments today, now, last few years, they're cutting education. They're cutting critical social programs. And there's this absolute pledge against raising taxes, but they don't seem to be too uncomfortable to raise your student fees. Now, that again is more bad news. And on top of all this, when you look at the public, when we try to get the pulse of the public and see where they are in terms of their government, we're seeing that it is fed up with a lack of responsiveness of government. We're seeing that the voter turnout is continuing to decline over the decades, notwithstanding the 2008 election, but the overall trends as voter turnout is lower. And the public is basically becoming very cynical about government. So what's my point in all this, besides the fact that I'm feeling good on some ways and very concerned and apprehensive in others? The point is, at the very time that we're making progress in diversifying our legislative bodies and government and becoming and making progress on diversity issues as a whole, our governments are becoming more gridlocked and dysfunctional, and the public is becoming more fed up, cynical, poisoned by misinformation, polarized, and mistrustful of the government in general. So I'm supposed to tell you, what are we, the students and the educators, supposed to do about this? Well, I have three things that I'd like to talk about briefly. Because clearly, we've got to change government. To do the things and to achieve the goals that we're talking about today, we've got to change government to help it become more functional and responsive. And also, we've got to change the conversation among our citizens that is occurring in this country to create more opportunities for constructive dialogue. And I would submit that the youth of our country, the students and the educators and the educational establishments could lead this change. It could be very important. 3 points. We have to be patient and calm and persistent. This is not the time to give up on a cause or a leader because the results are slow. And the case in point is with respect to President Obama. He came into office with impossible challenges and expectations. You know, economy in crisis, record unemployment, 2 wars, healthcare crisis, immigration reform needed, environmental issues, energy issues, education issues. And then in his first year, some of his ardent supporters are making condemning remarks and expressing the threatening abandonment of the leader. This is absolutely the wrong thing to do, and that, as the president notes and as we all know, this is big change. Big change needs time to evolve. We take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And if you look at the whole history of the civil rights movement, you will know that change is painful and it takes time and we have to be patient. This is not the time to be giving up on our leaders or being impatient with them. Similarly, there is much we hear these days that sets us off and makes us angry and causes us to lose our cool. Case in point, on the college campuses these days, when you see hangman's nooses or swastikas or racial parodies, it's enough to really get you angry and very upset. And when we see in our legislatures these racial and homophobic slurs and this poisonous misinformation, and Bruce talked about some of this poisonous information, and death panels, and Obama is a Muslim, and he's not even a U.S. citizen, and he's evil, and he's the enemy. Well, all these acts are to be condemned and are deeply disappointing. We're not helping the situation if we fly off the handle or engage in irrational rhetoric and behavior. It is really the time that we have to be patient and determined, take a deep breath, and move forward with civility. So be calm, patient, and persistent. Second, become knowledgeable about public policy issues and engage in dialogue aimed at bringing out the truth and giving people a chance to change their minds. It's not enough for us to be armed with our side of the issues and our arguments and go out there and spout our points of view to everyone else who may not hold those points of view. We need to understand the positions of the others and the arguments and the evidence they use, because this is about changing people's minds. And to change people's minds, you have to understand their thinking in order to do this. The last time someone lectured you and told you in no uncertain terms how wrong you were and why and what you needed to believe, were you listening? Did it change your mind? I don't know about you, but I usually end up feeling defensive in those situations, and I usually stop listening. So our task as educators and students is really to try to create a constructive dialogue and to try to get members of the public talking with one another again, and to help others, including ourselves, understand where lack of understanding and misinformation is leading to wrong conclusions. We really need to talk it out. Third, become politically active, vote, become involved with issues and candidates. Again, the younger voters, the younger people tend not to be politically active, tend not to care about politics, tend not to vote. And yet, all the public research shows that younger voters are more idealistic and actually have quite a bit of trust in government. And I know with studies and jobs and significant others and relationships and families and the preoccupations of youth, it's hard to find time and energy for involvement in politics or political matters. But I got to tell you, in my view, it needs to happen because how are we going to change these things we're talking about unless the young people get involved? And you won't be alone, because I see educational institutions in this country, higher education in particular, but also K-12, needing to become involved in this issue in bringing truth to the misinformation that is out there, in creating a forum for civil discussion and understanding these differences. The role of educational students is critical. So I urge you, in spite of everything you're doing, the fate of the country is at risk. All the good that has happened, we're not there yet. And the things I worry about, I know you worry about. I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, I know we promised some time for questions. Do we have any? Do we still have time? We promised to get you out of here at 1:30, and it is 1:30. Oh, it's 2 o'clock. Okay, good, great. So we do have time. So I see the questions coming forward. You want to go over them very quickly, Reyes, and then pick out one or two? While you're doing that, while we're looking at the questions and sending a couple forward, let me build on what some of our panelists have said, and just do that with a historical story. Right after the Second World War, President Roosevelt was meeting with Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill. And they were looking at the Soviet Union, what is now the Soviet Union, Russia. And President Roosevelt, being, I suppose, a stereotypical liberal that he is portrayed to be, looked at the Russians and noted how he felt sorry for them, that they had undergone the terrors of the czars, the Bolsheviks, the Stalinist era, the Second World War, and on and on and on. And that because of that, and because of the suffering of the Russian people, Roosevelt felt America had a special obligation to take care of the Russians. Winston Churchill looked at him and said, "Poor Russian people, hell, people get the government they deserve." And there's a lot of truth in that, because we have a tendency as a society, I think, to complain, but we have what we have because we want it, and if we don't want it, it's our obligation to do something about it. So lethargy and apathy are basically an affirmation of what we have. If you don't like it, then I think we all have an obligation to do something to change it. So we'll see who's brave enough to attack this question. President Obama is often referred to as the first, quote, black, unquote, president, when his true genetic roots are more African American than black. Would this have been more of a victory if the President of the United States were truly black, as in the case of descendant of slaves? Well, there's a question mark at the end. The question is, would this have been what was said earlier, have been more of a victory if the President of the United States were truly black, as in the descendant of slaves?
Okay. I guess I think I know or have an idea of what the question is. Barack Obama is from Africa, but he's not. His roots are not here in America. So his ancestors on his father's side were not slaves. I do think that part of the appeal in the casting of Barack Obama as a candidate was, in fact, that the fact that he was not descendant of slaves allowed Americans to let go of a certain guilt with regards to Afro-Americans and slavery. And so he sort of did have he was able to present himself as an immigrant as opposed to a direct descendant of slavery. And at the same time, because of his skin color and his African descent, he was recognized as being black. And so I think there was a certain opening up of the possibility for him, and we framed him as breaking with the civil rights tradition precisely because of that narrative.
Anyone else like to tackle that? No? Okay. Second question. Why do people find it so important to refer to him as a black president when he is also half white? Could it in any way be to give people reassurance that racism is on the decline when it clearly isn't?
I would say that the law of hypodescent, which is an American construction, that any admixture of black makes you black in this country, that regardless of your physiognomy, that if you were blonde and blue-eyed and you had a drop of black blood, you're black. And that's just the way it's been constructed since the 17th century here, and that nobody gets exempted from that. We often have students who make the point that they don't see this Well, they don't have to see it. The fact is that the law, since 1896, in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, has defined as black anybody with, I think, 1/16 black blood as black in the United States.
I would just add to that, since the 1980s, there was a multiracial movement of primarily parents who had multiracial children. And these are the group who petitioned for the change on the census so that we have multiple checks of racial classifications. And so there is a sort of space that's created in the current generation to claim a certain biraciality or multiraciality that didn't exist. Barack Obama is sort of contemporary of my generation. That didn't exist in the 1970s when he was a teenager. If he looked the least bit black, he was going to be labeled black, as Professor Walker said.
And I would ask all of you in the audience and to think about, the nature of this question really is, why is it in this society are we labeled externally as opposed to our being free to label ourselves to others, but others are always labeling us?
Well, certainly if he lived in Latin America, he wouldn't be defined as black because
That's
of his
correct.
education and financial situation. The Brazilians have a wonderful phrase, money whitens, and certainly he would satisfy that characteristic.
And I think that labeling of anyone, as Dr. Walker said, with any black blood would be considered black in America, that was because that blacks were considered inferior. And therefore, when you had any descendant or you appeared to be the least bit black, you had to label yourself as black. That was that clearly was an indication of the general American view that blacks were inferior to whites. And that's what that was based on. And we all know that in many cases that wasn't true at all. In some cases, some people maybe three of their four grandparents might have been white, but if one of them was black, then that made the definition black. And Barack Obama clearly identified himself as black when he was in the South Side of Chicago and worked in that community, and certainly in his choice of marriage and other things. Someone asked the question, how did he identify himself on the 2010 census? I have no idea, but I would imagine he identified himself as African American.
I would just like to add to that. We often forget historically about the Walter Whites, for instance, who was a leader of the NAACP, who could pass for white, and he used to go infiltrate the Klan in the South and do reconnaissance missions for the NAACP during the 40s, or the fact that W. Du Bois was very conscious of his white ancestry. This is sort of typical in Afro-American life, the mixed Native American, European ancestry, and the variety of color across the spectrum.
Our next question. Why do most people of color find themselves being questioned on their motives, intelligence, work, ethics, etc.?
Well, I think it's part of the racial history of the United States. I think that black is historically a suspect category in the United States, and when I laugh about that, it's just a fact, in that you get all sorts of questions about, as Chancellor Scott pointed out, about your qualifications or what you know or what you don't know. I mean, it's wonderful being a university professor, and it happens across the spectrum. I mean, all sorts of students will ask you all sorts of questions about things. If you're a minority or you're a woman professor, I think that it's just a fact of living in this society. And I think that after a while, one just says, well, it goes with the territory.
I thought it was very unusual when Barack Obama sometime asked him if he was truly black. He said, "I am," when I try to hail a cab.
Okay, here's our next question. When might America see a female president or an openly gay president?
Well, clearly this time we made the choice between the gender candidate and the racial candidate. I think that we will probably see a female vice president or presidential candidate. I wouldn't doubt it the next time around. I think that door has certainly been opened up now, and the possibility is there. Gay candidate, I think, we are far away from that. I mean, we are seeing this strong backlash to even a movement for just basic equal rights. So I think we're not yet there moving towards equality at that level.
Anyone else?
I'd just probably be a little more aggressive than Bruce on that subject. I think that if I live another hopefully 20, 30 years, that there's a very high probability we'll see both a female president and a gay president.
What's very interesting, what Tom just said really echoes what John Kennedy said back in the 60s, that he thought in another 30 or 40 years we'd see an African-American president. And so that's a certain kind of progress for sure, but for me, I guess that's rather slow.
Oh, slow. Okay.
And remember that to be elected to office, one generally has to move to the middle, and so it makes individuals who are viewed by the public as some way or another being out of the norm difficult to elect. I can guarantee you that it would be difficult to elect an openly atheist president. Yeah.
So are we saying that bias and prejudice against women is more powerful than that against non-whites? Is it the same? Is it different? Is it more pervasive, less pervasive? Is society oriented in a different way? Well, what's
No, well, I mean, I think that would, no. I think that we can measure in many, many different ways how women benefited from the open post-civil rights society. Just look at university professors, for instance, relative to racial minorities on campuses. So there's been massive movement on the gender front, very slow movement on the racial minority front. That's true in law offices, that's true in corporate offices, that's true in the CEOs and corporate backrooms. So no, I think we're more suggesting that American politics are we want centrist candidates. I think that's what Professor Scott's saying, and that just like Barack Obama can't run as the black president, we're not going to see a candidate run as the female candidate or as the gay candidate for quite some time, if we ever do.
And I think it all points to the fact that this is a deeply conservative country, that if the great cycle of American politics from roughly 1932 to 1964 constituted an apogee of liberalism, what we've seen in the post-64 period is a reaction to that. And you see that in the sort of reaction to the Obama presidency, that this was unthinkable, I think, in some ways. And the fact that it has happened has now brought out a lot of sensibilities in this country that we had hoped had disappeared, and that these people are really sort of anxious about this. It is the case that in the year 2050, the United States will no longer be a predominantly white nation, that it will be a more evenly racially balanced nation between so-called people of color and white people, and that's frightening a sector of the white populace of this country, and there's no denying that fact. And all of this talk about we want our country back, what they're saying is they want to think of the United States as it was created in the 18th century as a white racial state. And it's just, that seems to me to be quite apparent in much of this rhetoric.
Right, for sure. And I just add, and as the visible presence of racial minorities in my historically all-white town or community begins to change, that signifies that lack of control that I once had, or should now have.
Thank you. Next question. We work hard to get Barack Obama elected. Teacher in me wants to say get is not a verb.
We worked hard to elect Barack Obama. After Barack Obama was elected, however, his supporters have been taking a break. How can we continue to support Obama?
It's actually a couple of very interesting articles in Rolling Stone about this topic. You don't typically get all your political information from Rolling Stone, but they talked about how during his campaign, Barack Obama had mobilized through the internet and others a lot of the younger voters and voters that typically weren't politically active, and had mobilized them to write letters and gain funding and do a lot of work. And then he became president and relied more on the traditional Democratic Party machinery to communicate and work through on issues. And that all the people that were fired up and working actively for him kind of were no longer being communicated with. They kind of went into say, I'm ready to work, but I'm not getting any messages back from the president, I'm not being mobilized. And in the healthcare debate, late in the debate, I am told that they went back and revived some of that machinery and started trying to work through and mobilize the voters that had worked so hard for the president. So I personally kind of look at it maybe as something that he probably should have paid more attention to, and the voters and the people who really worked hard for him want to keep working, and they need to have that message and encouragement, and it seemed like they picked that message up.
Well, as someone who's had political experience, sometimes you have to settle for a half loaf when you can't get a full loaf, and you know that's the nature of politics, and there's always those who, on the other hand, are the voice of ideological purity, and they have their value. But for instance, if I had been in Congress, I would have voted for the health care reform bill. Was it the bill I wanted to see? No. I wanted to see something that was more of a single-payer system, which I think has proven to be quite successful in Western European countries. I would have wanted to have a public option. But I kind of went along with Dennis Kucinich when he got up and said, you know, to let this go down in flames will only empower those who want to destroy the presidency of Obama. And so that's the nature of the political game. Now, there are times when you finally say, I can't compromise anymore. I'd rather see, I've had bills that I authored that went down because I said, I'll go no further than this. This is where I'm going to stand. But on occasions when I thought that one of my bills with an amendment I could live with would pass and be signed into law, I was willing to do that. And that's one of the greatest difficulties of being in politics is to, you know, as the old Western song says, know when to hold them and know when to fold them. So I guess that's what happens.
I think it also speaks to a fundamental truth. There's a big difference between running for office and being elected and governing. Our last question, and it's a question that would demand a very thoughtful answer. Why are you considered a racist if you're white and you disagree with Obama's policies and expansion of government?
Where that came from is that in the 19th century, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment was deeply associated with the construction of the United States as a white nation, and that any government intervention on the part of blacks or minorities generally, and for that, has been seen as somehow inimical to white interests, that white is not constructed as a site of innocence in the United States, it's constructed as a site of power. And that power has now, since the 19th century, been slowly but surely being curtailed back to create a state in which there was equal opportunity and equality for other people. And much of this rhetoric against Obama is, quite frankly, racist It is not instrumental and not solely rooted in questions of policy. The Republican Party for 8 years ran this country, and many people in that party do not like the fact that you elected a black president, and that is not to be denied. It is a fact. And it is a fact that this has brought out behavior that people of my generation thought we would never see. I never thought you'd see people spitting on congressmen or calling them niggers, or even for that matter, sending hate mail to white female congresswomen. What kind of nonsense is this? It suggests that the idea of democracy is being delegitimized. You lose an election, you accept that fact, and then you come up with alternative programs. You don't just say no.
Yeah. I can't top that. I would submit that it is wrong to be labeled a racist if you simply disagree with the president and you do so in a civil way, and that you have reasons behind your disagreement. You shouldn't be labeled as a racist. There are different value judgments among people, and we can have different value judgments and not be labeled as racist. But when the behavior starts turning towards the kinds of things that Clarence is talking about, the spitting and the epithets and the whisperings behind the scenes, that's when racism is alive and well. And I would defend anybody's right to disagree with the president and not be a racist, but I would not tolerate the kind of behavior that Clarence is talking about.
And you know, when a large portion of people still believe that Barack Obama was born in Kenya and still claim that he's a Muslim, when all of the historical evidence is there to prove, you know, his birth certificate in Hawaii and the fact that he was a member of a Christian church for, I don't know, 20 years or so, there's something about that does smack of racism. I mean, you can't very easily say that that's not racist. And now, if you disagree with somebody's policies, that's another matter. But all this other tendency is pretty strongly racist.
And one could accept the fact if that was simply hearsay on the internet. But in fact, you know, Lou Dobbs, Glenn Beck, they have created a kind of a climate that generates fear. And of course, Lou Dobbs was given the national pulpit to profess that Obama was not in fact born here.
Well, and if I could add just a little bit, I think it's not so much the opposition, it's how you oppose and the basis on which you oppose, which I think is consistent with what we've been saying before. I think as a college student is now a member of our nation's educated elite, only about a quarter of our population has a college degree. It becomes your responsibility to become knowledgeable about policies and behavior and to be consistent in your support or your opposition. You know, one of the issues that I find interesting is one party is a very strong defender of state rights versus the rights of the federal government. Yet you need to look at the No Child Left Behind Act as perhaps the greatest intrusion on state rights the federal government has had in many, many years. And if you're worried about big government's intrusion in your life, I think you need to read the Patriot Act.
And what was the great intrusion in American life under the doctrine of states' rights but segregation?
So I think you know it's important that whether you support or oppose, you take the time to find out and to build for yourself a case of why you support or why you defend or why you oppose. And I think you also have to hold other people accountable in terms of their own political rhetoric. Are they engaging in sloganeering, or are they engaging in real intellectual analysis of a particular program or policy?
And the same is true about assertions of fiscal conservatism as well.
Well, that's true. Mr. Reagan, who's viewed as the greatest fiscal conservative in 1 year of his presidency, rang up a federal deficit that exceeded the historical total of all federal deficits to that date. That's quite an accomplishment. more so that he is then revered for his fiscal conservatism. But that's the kind of thing I mean by looking at the facts and making sure that the rhetoric is aligned with the facts, and that's how I think you can avoid being labeled anything. Well, with that, I hope we have given you much to think about and ponder. I want to thank our panelists. Clearly they came here prepared and ready to fire. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for coming and for your active listening and for contributing, all of us, to enhancing the intellectual climate of Sierra College. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Enjoyed what